On the morning of May 4, 1945, the mood inside the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Reims, France, was one of exhausted triumph. The air in the converted red-brick schoolhouse smelled of stale coffee, cigarette smoke, and the damp wool of uniforms that hadn't been changed in days. General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat at his desk, surrounded by the administrative debris of a collapsing empire. The Third Reich was in its death throes. To the north, Montgomery was accepting surrenders on the Lüneburg Heath. To the south, Kesselring's forces were disintegrating in Italy. Eisenhower was reviewing the preliminary drafts of the surrender protocols, the documents that would officially end the greatest conflict in human history. For the first time in years, the crushing weight on his shoulders seemed to lighten. The nightmare was ending. The guns were going silent. But the silence in the room was broken not by a cheering crowd, but by the heavy, hesitant footsteps of a staff officer entering without knocking. The officer held a single field report, his knuckles white as he gripped the clipboard. He handed it to General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff. Smith, a man known for his ulcers and his short temper, scanned the document. His face, usually a mask of bureaucratic efficiency, went slack. He looked up at Eisenhower, and the look in his eyes wasn't relief. It was dread. He announced that they had a situation with the Third Army. Eisenhower, barely looking up from a fuel allocation report, asked for the location. When Smith replied that General Patton was in Linz, Eisenhower blinked. His mind momentarily rejected the geography. Linz was in Austria. Linz was 80 miles beyond the agreed-upon stop line at the Enns River. Linz was deep inside the zone designated for Soviet occupation. The room went dead silent, the sound of the rain against the French windows suddenly sounding like the ticking of a bomb.
Eisenhower stood up and walked to the massive wall map, his movements stiff with fatigue. His finger traced the black line of the Enns River, the tributary of the Danube that served as the diplomatic boundary between the Western Allies and the Red Army. This line wasn't just a river, it was a promise. It was the physical manifestation of the Yalta Agreements signed in February by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. Everything east of that water belonged to Moscow. Eisenhower asked when the crossing had occurred. Smith replied that Third Army elements had crossed at 0400 hours on May 2nd without requesting authorization. Eisenhower stared at the map, visualizing the terrain. 80 miles in 48 hours through the mountainous defensive positions of the crumbling Wehrmacht. It wasn't a reconnaissance patrol. It was a full-scale invasion of an Allies' territory. Smith added the final crushing detail. The Soviet 6th Guards Tank Army was less than 30 miles east of the city. The geopolitical implications hit Eisenhower like a physical blow. American and Soviet forces were hurtling toward each other in a bottleneck in Upper Austria, and nobody had coordinated the link-up. There were no recognition signals, no agreed-upon stop lines, no protocols to prevent accidental firefights. Worse, Patton had just violated a treaty signed by a dead president, Roosevelt, and entrusted to a new, untested one, Truman. Eisenhower ordered Smith to get Patton on the phone immediately, but the Third Army commander, elusive as smoke, was unavailable. His headquarters reported he was at a forward command post, moving too fast for the wire to catch him. It took 4 agonizing hours of radio relays and field telephone patches to finally establish a connection. When the line finally crackled to life at 1400 hours, the voice on the other end was unmistakably George Patton's, high-pitched, confident, and utterly unrepentant. When Eisenhower demanded to know what the hell he was doing in Linz, Patton's answer was maddeningly practical. He explained that the bridges over the Enns were intact, the Germans were retreating, and someone had to secure the area to prevent anarchy. He argued that if he hadn't taken the city, the chaos would have been unmanageable. Eisenhower countered with the cold reality of diplomacy. The Soviets were supposed to secure that area. These were signed international agreements. Stalin was already sending angry cables through General Marshall asking why American tanks were parking in his designated occupation zone. Patton's response was a chilling glimpse into the future. He told Eisenhower that possession was 9/10 of the law. They were there, they had taken the ground without firing a shot, and the local Austrian population was throwing flowers at them because they were terrified of the Red Army. He argued that they should negotiate from a position of strength, holding the ground they had bled for, rather than handing it over to a totalitarian regime they would likely be fighting next. Eisenhower rubbed his temples, trying to bridge the gap between Patton's tactical brilliance and his strategic blindness. He explained that President Truman had been in office for only 3 weeks. The entire post-war order was being negotiated right now, in real time. By driving a tank column through the Yalta Agreement, Patton wasn't just capturing a city, he was dismantling the Grand Alliance. Eisenhower ordered him to hold his current position and prepare to withdraw back to the Enns River immediately. The silence on the line was heavy with insubordination. When Patton finally spoke, his voice was sharp with defiance. He refused to accept the premise of withdrawal. He claimed these were American positions now, won by American initiative. He argued that the Soviets hadn't arrived yet, so the ground belonged to whoever held the flag. Eisenhower heard the background noise of a busy headquarters, the hum of radios, the shouting of orders, and realized Patton wasn't slowing down. He was digging in. The conversation ended abruptly with Patton hanging up, leaving the Supreme Commander staring at a dead receiver in a silent room. By the morning of May 5th, the situation had escalated from a military oversight to an international crisis. Soviet Marshal Fyodor Tolbukhin, commanding the southern group of forces, sent an urgent, blistering communication to Schaeff headquarters. Red Army units approaching from Czechoslovakia had encountered American armored reconnaissance screens deep in their sector. Tolbukhin didn't ask for an explanation. He demanded one. His maps showed Linz squarely in the Soviet sphere, yet his forward observers reported American Shermans patrolling the city squares and American flags flying over the municipal buildings. The message was polite on the surface, written in the formal language of diplomacy, but the undertone was unmistakable. Get out, or we cannot guarantee the safety of your troops. Eisenhower sat at his desk, drafting a response that walked a tightrope over a canyon. He replied to Tolbukhin that Third Army had pursued fleeing German units across the Enns to ensure the total destruction of the enemy forces, a half-truth designed to buy time. He assured the Soviet Marshal that American forces would coordinate regarding final boundaries, carefully avoiding the word withdrawal. He didn't mention that he had lost control of his Third Army commander. He didn't mention that intelligence reports showed the 11th Armored Division establishing defensive fighting positions facing east, treating their Soviet allies like the next enemy. And he certainly didn't mention that Patton had no intention of leaving. That afternoon, the pressure from Washington reached a boiling point. General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff and the man Eisenhower respected most in the world, sent a flash priority cable. The Soviet ambassador, Andrei Gromyko, had lodged a formal protest with the State Department. Stalin himself had sent a personal message to President Truman, questioning whether the United States intended to honor its commitments, or if the Yalta Accords were merely paper to be torn up by rogue generals. Marshall's words were terse and direct. Resolve the Linz situation immediately. The president could not afford a public confrontation with the Soviets days before the official surrender ceremony. Truman needed to show strength and reliability, not duplicity. Eisenhower read the cable twice,
feeling the heat of the political spotlight burning through the roof of his headquarters. He called for an immediate intelligence update. The officer who stepped forward pointed to the map of Austria, which was now cluttered with markers. The situation was worse than Eisenhower feared. Third Army had moved the 65th Infantry Division forward to support the armor. Estimates put American strength in the Linz sector at approximately 23,000 troops, fully combat-loaded. Facing them, the Red Army's 6th Guards Tank Army was 18 miles east, and Marshal Konev was moving elements of the 4th Ukrainian Front south to reinforce them. 80,000 Soviet troops, hardened by the brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, were converging on the city. The mathematics of disaster were laid out on the table. 23,000 Americans versus 80,000 Soviets, separated by a few miles of Austrian countryside and the sheer force of George Patton's will. When Eisenhower asked what Patton was doing, the answer confirmed his worst fears. Patton wasn't just sitting in Linz, he was administering it. On May 6th, Austrian officials from the city administration had approached Third Army headquarters requesting assistance.
The city's infrastructure was crumbling, the population was starving, and refugees were flooding the streets. They didn't ask the Soviets for help, they asked the Americans. And Patton, assuming the role of a Roman proconsul, had said yes. By midday, American civil affairs officers were running the city. They were reopening schools, repairing water mains, and organizing food distribution for 180,000 civilians. Patton had established a de facto military government in a zone designated for Soviet control. He had made the American presence structural, weaving it into the daily life of the city, making any future withdrawal a logistical and humanitarian nightmare. But there was something even more volatile than the city itself. Smith handed Eisenhower a report concerning Mauthausen. The concentration camp complex, one of the most horrific in the Nazi system, lay just 15 miles east of the Enns River, technically deep inside the Soviet zone. Third Army elements had liberated it on May 5th. They found tens of thousands of skeletal survivors and evidence of industrial-scale murder. Patton had visited the camp personally. He had been physically ill at the sight of the bodies stacked like cordwood. In a fury of righteous indignation, he had ordered the 11th Armored to secure the camp and its surroundings, vowing that the survivors would receive American medical care and protection. He had told his staff that he would be damned if he handed these people over to another regime of camps and secret police. The moral weight of Mauthausen gave Patton a shield against political pressure. How could Eisenhower order him to abandon the victims of the Holocaust to the Red Army? The Soviet reaction to this expansion was immediate and hostile. Marshal Tolbukin sent a second, far less polite communication. He referred to the American presence as an illegal occupation and demanded a pullback to the Enns River line within 24 hours. He reported that Soviet reconnaissance patrols had been turned away by American roadblocks. The friction was becoming kinetic. 2 reports reached Schaeff of American and Soviet patrols aiming weapons at each other at crossroads. No shots had been fired yet, but the safety catches were off. The tension was a spark hovering over a pool of gasoline. Eisenhower walked to the window, looking out at the quiet French street, realizing that while the war with Germany was ending, a new, stranger conflict was being born in the mountains of Austria. He turned back to Smith and issued the order he had dreaded. He instructed his chief of staff to draft a formal withdrawal order. Third Army was to pull back to the west bank of the Enns River within 48 hours. He stated he would sign it in the morning after speaking with Marshall again to confirm the political cover. He told Smith to notify Patton that he was flying to Austria to deliver the order personally. He wanted to look George in the eye when he told him to retreat. He believed that the weight of a direct order from the Supreme Commander, delivered face to face, would finally break Patton's intransigence. What Eisenhower didn't know was that 300 miles away, in a requisitioned hotel in Linz, George Patton was already inoculating his command against that very order. That same evening, May 6th, Patton gathered his division commanders, General Charles Kilburn of the 11th Armored and Major General James Polk of the 65th Infantry. The atmosphere in the room was not one of subordination, but of conspiracy. Patton spread a map on the table and told them simply, "We are staying." When Kilburn pointed out that Schaeff hadn't authorized the occupation, Patton cut him off. He declared that he didn't care about Schaiff's authorizations. He cared about the reality on the ground. He told them that the Soviets wanted Austria, and if they wanted it, they could come and take it, if they dared. General Polk, a cautious man, warned that the Soviets were massing significant forces. Patton's response was a masterclass in calculated aggression. He said that if the Soviets decided to press the issue, it would be their problem, not his. He pointed out that Third Army held the high ground, the best defensive terrain between Linz and Berlin, and had the total support of the local population. He brought up Mauthausen, his voice dropping to a growl, stating that those prisoners were not going under Soviet administration while he drew breath. He ordered his commanders to fortify every key approach to the city. He wanted tank destroyers dug in on the eastern roads. He wanted artillery pre-sighted on the intersections. When Polk suggested that Eisenhower would inevitably order a withdrawal, Patton revealed his strategy. He agreed that the order would come, but he reminded them that withdrawing an army in contact with a potential enemy was a complex logistical operation. It took time to move 23,000 men and thousands of vehicles. Logistics, he noted with a wry smile, could take a week to coordinate, maybe longer, and a lot could happen in a week. He was buying time, gambling that the political situation would shift, or that the sheer fact of American possession would force Washington to renegotiate the Yalta lines. He gave them one final, crucial instruction. There were to be no incidents with Soviet forces. If Soviet patrols approached, the Americans were to be polite, professional, and immovable. They were to act like they belonged there. As the division commanders filed out, Colonel Oscar Koch, Patton's loyal intelligence chief, lingered. He warned Patton that this course of action would create a crisis at the highest levels of the Allied command. Patton walked to the window, looking out over the Danube, and delivered the rationale that would haunt historians for decades. He told Koch that they had spent 4 years defeating Germany, only to hand half of Europe to the Soviets, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary. He said that nobody in Washington or London seemed to understand the magnitude of the mistake. He acknowledged that Eisenhower was a politician who had to worry about alliances, but he asserted that his own job was to win. And to Patton, winning meant not letting the Iron Curtain fall on Linz. He knew he would be ordered to withdraw, but until that paper was in his hand, he would hold the line. He told Koch to get some sleep because the next day was going to be interesting. He was right. The next day, Germany surrendered, and the world changed forever, leaving Patton's army stranded on the wrong side of history's new border. On May 7, 1945, the pretext for George Patton's advance officially evaporated. In a red brick schoolhouse in Reims, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces. The war in Europe was over. The guns fell silent from the Baltic to the Alps. For millions of soldiers, this was a moment of delirious joy. For Dwight D. Eisenhower, it was the moment his tactical headache transformed into a full-blown diplomatic emergency. The "fog of war" excuse, the argument that Patton was pursuing active enemy units, was gone. Now, American troops were simply standing on Soviet-designated soil in peacetime, armed and digging in. The friction was no longer military,
It was purely political, and the friction heat was rising fast. Within hours of the surrender, reports flooded into SHAEF headquarters detailing a dangerous standoff. Soviet reconnaissance units, emboldened by the victory, were probing the American lines around Linz. They weren't shooting, but they were driving their T-34s right up to the American checkpoints, gun barrels leveled, testing the resolve of the 11th Armored Division. President Truman, barely settled into the Oval Office, was besieged.
Stalin sent a message accusing the United States of bad faith, implying that the Americans intended to keep Austria as a trophy of war. Truman, desperate to prove he could manage the Grand Alliance as well as Roosevelt had, cabled Eisenhower with a directive that left no room for interpretation. The United States would honor the Yalta agreements. The occupation zones were fixed. The Red Army was the legal authority in Upper Austria, east of the Enns. Eisenhower was to resolve the situation immediately, or Washington would be forced to issue a public reprimand. Simultaneously, a personal and secret cable arrived from Winston Churchill. The British Prime Minister, who had long harbored deep suspicions about Soviet intentions, played a different tune. He urged Eisenhower to consider the strategic value of Linz and the humanitarian cost of a Soviet takeover. Churchill implied that Patton's insubordination might actually be a stroke of genius, a necessary wedge against the descending Iron Curtain. But Churchill couldn't say this publicly. Eisenhower was caught between his president's orders, his allies' secret whispers, and his rogue general's stubbornness. Eisenhower realized that cables and radio messages were useless. Patton was filtering them, delaying them, or ignoring them. There was only one card left to play. On the morning of May 9th, the Supreme Commander boarded a C-47 transport plane at Reims. He was accompanied by General Omar Bradley, Patton's immediate superior, who sat in grim silence throughout the flight. They were flying to Linz. Eisenhower was done sending orders. He was going to deliver the withdrawal command in person, and if Patton refused, Eisenhower was prepared to relieve him of command on the spot. It was a measure of the crisis that the Supreme Commander of all Allied forces felt he had to personally fly into a forward zone to control one of his own subordinates. The plane touched down on a dusty airstrip outside Linz, where the air smelled of aviation fuel and the thawing Austrian spring. Patton was waiting on the tarmac. He was a vision of martial splendor, perfectly pressed uniform, knee-high polished cavalry boots, and his trademark ivory-handled revolvers glinting at his hips. He saluted sharply as Eisenhower descended the stairs. "Welcome to Linz, Ike," he said, his voice booming, his demeanor that of a gracious host welcoming a guest to his estate. Eisenhower did not smile. He returned the salute mechanically and dispensed with the pleasantries. He told Patton they needed to talk, immediately and in private. They requisitioned a nearby command tent, leaving their staffs outside in the sun. The silence inside was heavy, suffocating. Eisenhower looked at the man who had been both his greatest combat asset and his worst liability. He didn't shout. He spoke with the quiet, crushing weight of authority. He told Patton that he was ordering a full withdrawal to the Enns River line. This wasn't a suggestion from SHAEF. It was a direct order from the President of the United States. Patton's reaction was not submission. His jaw tightened, and the mask of the obedient soldier slipped. He looked Eisenhower in the eye and asked if he truly understood what he was asking. He pointed out the window toward the city and the camps beyond. He asked if Eisenhower knew what would happen to the Austrians who had greeted them as liberators the moment the American tanks pulled back. He spoke of Mauthausen, of the skeletal survivors who were just beginning to believe they were safe. He asked if the purpose of the war was to liberate Europe only to hand half of it over to a tyranny that was arguably more dangerous than the one they had just destroyed. He challenged Eisenhower's conscience, asking if he was willing to be the man who signed the warrant for the Soviet occupation of these people. Eisenhower countered with the reality of the world as it was, not as Patton wished it to be. He reminded Patton that they had won the war as a coalition. The Soviet Union had bled more than any other nation to destroy the Wehrmacht. Agreements had been made to keep that coalition together to build a lasting peace. To break those agreements now, Eisenhower argued, would be to start World War III before the ink was dry on the surrender of World War II. He accused Patton of trying to provoke a conflict that the American people had no stomach for. "We won the war, George," Eisenhower said. "I am trying to win the peace." Patton's response was the stuff of legend, a moment of crystallized foresight that cut through the diplomatic fog. He stepped closer to the map table and slammed his hand down on the border of the occupation zones. He told Eisenhower that they had defeated the wrong enemy. He argued that the Germans were finished, a broken people, but the Soviets were ascendant. He predicted that Stalin would not stop at the Enns River nor at the Elbe. He warned that they were dismantling the only barrier left in Europe against Soviet expansion. "We are going to have to fight them eventually," Patton said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Why not do it now, while we have the army here, while we have the momentum, while we have the bomb? Give me 3 weeks, Ike, and I can be in Moscow." The room went deathly silent. Bradley, standing in the corner, looked at the floor. It was treasonous talk, politically radioactive, yet strategically haunting. Eisenhower looked at his friend, seeing the madness and the genius intertwined. He knew Patton was right about the threat. Eisenhower's own intelligence reports painted a dark picture of Soviet behavior in Poland and Romania. But he also knew that the American public wanted their sons home, not marching on Moscow. He couldn't unleash Patton, but he realized he couldn't simply dismiss his logic either. Patton had created a fait accompli. The Americans were in Linz. That was a tangible fact, a chip on the poker table of post-war Europe. Eisenhower made a decision that bridged the gap between the politician and the warrior. He walked to the map and stared at the Enns River line. He told Patton that he was right about one thing: possession was leverage. He refused to start a war with the Soviets, but he admitted that simply abandoning the ground without getting something in return was poor strategy. He turned to Patton and offered a compromise that was barely legal. He would delay the enforcement of the withdrawal order for 1 week, 7 days, not a minute more. During that week, Eisenhower would use the fact of Patton's occupation to force the Soviet diplomats to the table. He would trade the withdrawal for concessions, adjustments to the zone boundaries, guarantees for the transit of refugees, and secure protocols for the Mauthausen survivors. "You created this mess, George," Eisenhower said. "Now I'm going to use it." He warned Patton that if the Soviets refused to negotiate, the withdrawal would proceed exactly as planned on May 15th. There would be no resistance, no incidents, no accidental firefights. Patton was to pack up his army and leave. Eisenhower extended his hand. 1 week, he repeated, and then you get back on your side of the river. Patton looked at the hand, then at the map, then at Eisenhower. He realized it was the best deal he was going to get. He took Eisenhower's hand and shook it. "Understood, sir," Patton said. "But I hope history records that we had the boot on their neck and you let me take it off." Eisenhower left Linz an hour later. As the plane climbed away, Bedell Smith leaned over and told Patton, "For what it's worth, General, a lot of us at SHAEF think you're right." Patton watched the plane disappear, then turned back to his staff to prepare for the strangest week of the war. For 7 days, the Third Army held its ground. Behind the scenes, a diplomatic fury erupted. American negotiators, emboldened by the fact that their tanks were already parked in the disputed territory,
pressed their Soviet counterparts. They argued that since the Americans were already administering the region, moving the line slightly was just a matter of practicality. The Soviets, eager to avoid a shooting war with the Americans while they were still consolidating their hold on Eastern Europe, blinked. The final agreement was a subtle but significant victory. The occupation line was adjusted. It wasn't the total victory Patton wanted. Linz proper would eventually be handed over. But the Americans retained control of key bridgeheads and sectors north of the city for a transition period. Crucially, the delay allowed thousands of refugees to flee west across the Enns before the border snapped shut. It allowed the American medical teams at Mauthausen to stabilize the survivors and transfer the most critical cases to hospitals in the permanent American zone. Patton's insubordination had bought salvation for thousands of people who would otherwise have vanished into the Gulag system. On May 15th, true to his word, Patton ordered the withdrawal. It was a somber affair. The American flags came down from the municipal buildings in Linz. The tanks reversed their engines and rolled back across the bridges. The Austrian civilians lined the streets, watching in silence, many of them weeping as the dust of the retreating Shermans settled. Soviet trucks rolled in from the east an hour later. The Iron Curtain had descended, but it had fallen a few miles further east than Stalin had intended, thanks to the stubbornness of one American general. The aftermath of the Linz incident rippled through history in ways that few understood at the time. Patton's diaries from this period are filled with dark prophecies. He wrote of the Mongol horde and the inevitable clash of civilizations. He felt isolated, a Cassandra cursing the blindness of his superiors. But he wasn't as alone as he thought. Eisenhower, in his private correspondence, began to adopt a harder line against the Soviets almost immediately after the Linz encounter. The confrontation had stripped away the illusion of eternal friendship. It forced the American command to treat the Soviets not just as allies, but as rivals. 7 months later, in December 1945, George Patton was paralyzed in a freak car accident in Heidelberg, Germany. He died 12 days later, never seeing the world he had predicted come to pass. But as the years turned into decades, the map of Europe froze along the lines of mistrust that Patton had drawn in the Austrian mud. 2 years after the Linz standoff, the Truman Doctrine was announced, formalizing the policy of containment. The Marshall Plan was launched to rebuild Western Europe as a bulwark against communism. NATO was formed to do exactly what Patton had wanted to do in 1945. Hold the line against the Red Army. Eisenhower, writing his memoirs years later during his own presidency, reflected on the burden of command and the difficulty of managing men like Patton. He acknowledged that while Patton's timing was impossible, his instincts were fundamentally correct. The incident at the Enns River became a microcosm of the entire Cold War. A dangerous standoff, a test of wills, and a negotiated peace that satisfied no one but prevented the apocalypse. In the end, Patton's unauthorized seizure of Linz stands as one of the most fascinating what-ifs of the 20th century. It was the moment when the hot war ended and the Cold War began, sparked by a general who refused to stop fighting until he was sure the right side had won. When he died, his last journal entry echoed the sentiment he had shouted in that tent in Linz. "We defeated the wrong enemy." History would spend the next 45 years deciding if he was right.